Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Real Talks. I'm Kyle. Unfortunately, David is still recovering, but he will be back very shortly. But without further ado, I should say that today is a very special episode of Real Talks because we have a very special guest. He hails from Oak Park, Illinois. He graduated from Northwestern University with a bachelor's in radio, TV, and film. And he's gone on to work on many TV shows from The OC, Gossip Girl, Fringe, Under the Dome, The Umbrella Academy. And currently, he is the editor on HBO's The Last of Us, which is the #1 hit show in the world right now. So, without further ado, I welcome Timothy Goode to Real Talks. How are you, Timothy?
How are you? I'm doing
good.
Great.
So excited for this interview.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. So I'm excited.
So we'll get into The Last of Us very shortly, but I want to start off the top with a question that I think it really fascinates me when it comes to anybody working in any profession, and it is, what made you want to become an editor? What point of your life did you say, this is a job I want to do? Was it a movie that inspired you, a TV show that inspired you? What do you think?
I've thought about this a lot because I'm always like, I'm someone who likes to figure out things and solve puzzles, and the puzzle of who the F you are is kind of a big one. So I'm like, who am I? Why do I do this? Why do I like this? And I've sort of been able to figure out that, I was in Oak Park, Illinois, which you mentioned. I was surrounded by all of this incredible architecture, and it was Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of like home base for like 20 years. And so I was always surrounded by this beautiful architecture. My parents would take me to the Frank Lloyd Wright house, and I was sort of surrounded by these beautiful things. And then, of course, toys and these little blocks and building blocks and whatnot. And so I was constantly sort of building things as a kid because I was in this place that had all this architecture. And I was also very drawn to music. And so I loved playing the piano. I loved learning the piano. I loved the idea of how music has this sort of ability to affect you emotionally, affect you, and affect so many people on a similar level. And I was like, well, what is this that is causing people to all feel the same thing at the same time? I was building model airplanes when I was a teenager, etc., which didn't really track for me, but it was really cool to be detailed, and I loved the process of like the little things that ended up being this really great sort of whole object. And then, of course, one day they fell off of my my crappily. I put it in the shelf myself. I shouldn't have. And yeah, that was my elf on the shelf experience. It all fell and crashing down, and I was like, well, that's that. But in terms of editing, I got really excited about it in high school because I was lucky enough. I went to a public high school, Oak Park River Forest High School, that had a television studio that was part of their curriculum. And it was like, as soon as I sort of walked in there, I'm like, whoa, this is amazing. It's very similar to sort of the idea of building things and whatnot. And immediately I took to the editing process. And I had a really great mentor there named Don Lenny, who was the teacher there and basically ran that whole program for many, many, many decades. And he said, oh, you're really taken to this editing thing, aren't you? I said, yeah, I don't know what it is about it. And that was when like actually editors were like, you'd have to hit like in, out on a tape and this and that. A tape deck was like 2 tape decks would start spooling and whatnot. So I'm like, whoa, this is kind of wild. But at the same time, I started using music and pictures together. So a combination between using music and pictures together kind of gave me this ability to sort of see how rhythm and emotion could work as one. So I was very, very much about doing that, and got some opportunities in high school to actually work with some professionals in the business in the city of Chicago. And they said, oh, okay, all right, you know what you're doing here. And I wanted to go to a film school, and I was very excited about going to a film school. And I was also kind of excited about going to a good school as well, because I was a pretty smart cookie. Either that or I worked really hard at getting good grades. It's one of the two, which is okay. I'll take either. And so I was able to choose to go to Northwestern, which was also in Chicago. And there I really kind of took to the editing as well. That was when the Avid first came out, and they got a couple near my last year there. So I got to sort of learn on the Avid there. And when I moved to Los Angeles, I just started to try and figure out how to make this a career. And so that's how it all happened.
Now, would you say that in the numerous number of jobs you've had, I think one of your earliest jobs I noticed on IMDb was in working on the Lost in Space film, which
Yeah.
I remember I watched that one as a kid, and like that must have been a very informative moment in your life. But like, would you say there was any? I mean, it could be that, but like, are there any specific jobs you've worked on that have really helped you today, like that you are really grateful for being a part of?
Good question. And I'll tell you this, every single job was important, and for different. I know that seems like a ridiculous answer, but I
No,
truly
no, it's
believe that
great.
your experience is molded as a creative professional, as an editor, as a filmmaker, anything, by every experience that you have, and each experience teaches you what it's like to do something like this, what it's like to do something like that. What happens when it doesn't work? What happens when it does work? I've been lucky enough to be on a couple of things that have worked really, really well, and I'm part of that team that helped make that work, and it's very gratifying to see that happen. But I really feel like every experience has taken me to where I am right now in the strangest way. Every decision led to this point, whether or not it was destiny or not. It was always my process has been, what's in front of me right now? What is the best decision for me right now? I don't know what the best decision really is, but right now, what's the best decision? And you mentioned Lost in Space, which I'd love to just sort of give you a little backstory.
Please, please.
It was my very first paid job. So it was very cool because I had actually interned at New Line Cinema in their development department in 1995 and 1996 in the summers through the Northwestern sort of internship program, which was kind of non-existent, but we made it happen. And I worked in development, and it was script writing and script things, and because that's what I could get. There was not really a post-production internship sort of pathway at that time. So a lot of my friends were into development, and a lot of my friends now are incredibly successful people and producers, television producers, heads of studios, etc. It's incredible to see all of them. And so we all were interning at different development places. And so New Line was the place that I was. And so I was there during the making of Seven, etc. And The Island of Dr. Moreau, and crazy, wild experiences such as that. And Boogie Nights was a script that was brought in at that time, I remember, and going, whoa, holy, this is wild. But I didn't like it. And I realized that there was just no way I was going to like this kind of thing. So I asked them, I said, hey, you must have a post-production department. And they said, well, of course we do. I said, I really think I'd be better off there. And so when I moved here, they were very kind. And they said, we're going to get you interviews with all of our post supervisors. So I've moved, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to have a job, and it's going to be great. And I need money because I had none. And so I met with all of these post supervisors, and they were so kind. And all of them said the same thing, which was, oh, we have nothing right now. So thanks for coming in. I'm like, crushed. I'm crushed. What? This was supposed to be easy. It's not easy. And so I walked away, and I was like, okay, so I have to do this my own way. And so I wrote letters at the time, which is what you did, to like 100 or 200 companies in the Variety print edition of all the films that were being photographed around the town. And one person got back to me and said, oh, we have this independent film we're doing. We need an assistant editor, but we don't have any money. But it's at night. And I said, I'll do anything right now to just do something close to what I'd like to be doing. So I did that. And near about the 3-month part of that, I'm like, I'm almost out of money. I'm not making money. This is really problematic. I don't know what to do. I have to find a job. And so at that crazy instance, I get a phone call from one of the post supervisors on New Line. And they said, okay, I have this project that I might need a PA for. Would you like to interview for it? I said, of course I would. And then 2 hours later, I get another call from another post supervisor at New Line saying, hey, I have this project that I need a PA for that I might. come interview for? And I said, of course I'll come interview for both of these things. Are you crazy? So I came in and I was like, thank you, thank you, thank you. The first person says, so I'm doing this movie. It's called American History X with Edward Norton, being edited by, Alan Hyme, the famous editor of all that jazz, etc. I'm like, yes. I said, yes, I'm in. And that would be incredible. And then I left her office and I went down the hall to the other person's office, and the other person said, so I'm doing this movie called Lost in Space. And it's going to be really great. It's a big science fiction project, and we need someone in our LA offices as a PA. I said, okay. And then she said, it's also a non-union feature. And so if there's an opportunity down the line for you to be an assistant editor on it, you could potentially get days into the union, which is what you would need to do. And at that point, I realized that there was that path in front of me. There was those two choices. And I said, I have to choose the one that makes the most pragmatic sense. So immediately, Lost in Space won. And I've never regretted it because it's taken me in so many different incredible directions. I learned from one of the greatest editors, Ray Lovejoy, who did like 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, the original, Tim Burton Batman, and Aliens, to name just a few. And the guy was the nicest man. And it taught me very early on that in order to really impress other people as a creative professional is that kindness is key. And I was like, I generally think of myself as a kind person anyway, but this sort of solidified that as a tactic going forward. Is like, don't think of all of the other people you may have heard about that are like mean and nasty and whatnot. But I've always thought of it as like the most generous and gentle people are the ones that I think people are closest to and feel a kinship to. And also editing is kind of that art where you have to be an empath and an emotionally open person. So all those things have stemmed from that experience.
Now, what's interesting is like just like Lost in Space and a number of your other projects are based around like genre entertainment based TV series mostly. And like you have a whether it's a Under the Dome, Fringe, even Last of Us now. What is it? I mean, is it a coincidence, or do you really love these projects where you really are dealing with a lot of these science fiction based concepts, a lot of these sometimes fantastical concepts. In the case of the Umbrella Academy, a really comic book type concept. Is that something you just also really love yourself?
I do love it. It's not necessarily something I sought out, though. Interestingly enough, it all sort of came from sort of coincidence, weirdly. Fringe is something I did after Gossip Girl, which was the weirdest, sort of 180 you can imagine. Like, what? How did that work? But honestly, it worked because I felt like, and I still feel like, the best sort of genre work is relationship sort of editing, in that it is sort of encircled in this sort of fantastical world. It's not about like the, ooh, wow, look at that weird looking thing. It's, ooh, look at these people navigating this wild world, as opposed to some sort of a focus on the weirdness of the things. I always focus on the characters within that world. And one of the things that the producers of Fringe said is that we're really just a family drama that's wrapped up in a science fiction package. And I thought about that a lot. I said, that's a really cool thing. Like that makes sense because ultimately that will connect with anybody who watches it, because ultimately everyone has some experience with, family and or drama and or family drama. So, so that to me made a lot of sense. And so a lot of the people that I met at Fringe were doing things of that sort of ilk, and it allowed me to sort of go with them and doing other projects. For example, there was something called Midnight Texas that I did, which was a fantastical sort of elemented show with Monica Breen, who was a writer on Fringe. And then working with Nils Arden Oplev on Under the Dome came through my experience with Fringe, because he had directed a movie called Dead Man Down that I helped them edit. And so then,
which I do own on Blu-ray.
So do I. We're the two people. Although it was popular on Netflix last year, which was so weird.
Yeah.
But again, relationships. That's all. That was always what it was to me.
Um, I think when it comes to these types of shows, it's interesting because you've really been through a huge change in like the television landscape when you look at Fringe being on network television, Under the Dome network television, but then when you go to say the Umbrella Academy, which is now on Netflix, now we're dealing with streaming, and even going to Last of Us on HBO, going to a cable network, which um I mean, with the streaming wars going on now, it's a wonder how HBO, is really still the top in my opinion in terms of content. Is it when you're working on these different shows, do you see that difference? What is it like to work on like a network TV show compared to a streaming show where all the episodes like drop at once?
Right. No, I mean, and I actually worked on a network show where all the episodes dropped at once at one point, which makes no sense. But
Wow.
it was called Aquarius. It was a David Duchovny series
Oh yes.
regarding Charles Manson. I remember like everything dropped at once, but then also they had it airing on NBC simultaneously. So it was this very odd sort of hybrid model.
Probably I think one of those like when you had like an NBC streaming service where like you could watch it on there. I think I do remember when they did things like that, which were yeah.
Yeah, two different versions. We had the R-rated version and the network version actually of that show, which was fun. Also a little chaotic, but we managed. But in terms of your question, it's like um, the nice thing about Netflix and HBO is, of course, they are not beholden to specific time frames where you have to hit a certain number in order for you to have that story get onto the air, because it's a specific number in network. It's 42 minutes, 30 seconds, 10 frames, and that's it. I mean, in the last thing I did for a network show, that was the number you had to hit, and any more than that, you had to trim something. You had to find a creative solution in order to hit that exact number. You could be a little shorter. They didn't mind that. Not too short, of course, because then it's like, well, what are we paying for? But you could definitely, be a little shorter. But in general, like the difficult part was, and I always liked the difficult part because it forced you to think creatively about how to trim something and keep the honesty of the experience without hurting it, which is a big task in and of itself. And I love that experience that I had because of that reason. There's so many episodes of Network that I did that I'm super proud of. The Fringe episode of Marionette in the third season I can watch that to this day. I remember it was originally 62 minutes and now it's 42 minutes. And it still feels perfect to me, the length it is, because the showrunners and I were driven to tell the story in the perfect way, and we made this. I feel like really smart decisions on what had to go, and what had to stay, and what couldn't be trimmed down in terms of like making it just go faster. There's all this discussion on pace versus interest, and sometimes people will say let's pace everything up, just make it real fast, and I said, well, that's not the same as interest. If you're pacing everything up but no one's understanding what's happening, it's actually slower, because people aren't actually understanding the story that's happening, and therefore they're sort of tuning out and they're sort of leaning back as opposed to leaning forward, and that's the worst kind of sort of crunching you can imagine, I think. So working on the Netflix and the HBO, you could find that balance of making sure that you're not overstaying your welcome, because you don't want to like have something super long. And the third episode of The Last of Us has a much longer cut out there, but HBO was kind enough to give us the extra time over the hour. They generally want things in the hour, which makes sense for them for their programming. But they were generous enough to give us those extra 12 minutes or 13 minutes, I think, to tell the proper story for the third episode of Last of Us, because we at that point could not figure out what else to take away without it harming sort of the structure and the bones and the emotions of that story.
As like an editor, do you like seeing the deleted scenes, like be released for a show or a movie?
Sometimes. I mean, sometimes I go, oh yeah, that makes sense that they deleted that. That tracks. Or sometimes I go, it's like seeing like the Mona Lisa had like an extra part of the background, and oh, we never seen that, and but the Mona Lisa itself is the artwork, and why am I seeing
Yeah.
an extra piece of it that wasn't part of it, that they said no, just go with this portion of it. You know what I mean? Like it's like a lot of the creative decisions that happen are because you say we're gonna we don't need it, and as cool as it was as a concept to start, it ultimately doesn't belong anymore. And so it kind of gives it this strange sort of echo of maybe it was supposed to be there. And then, of course, some people are going to say, why wasn't that in? And you say, well, if that was in, we would have had to lose this. Oh, you couldn't take that out. And I go, exactly. So these are the sort of the scale decisions you have to weigh when you're making anything. And again, not overstaying your welcome.
I do remember back in the day they would release like TV deleted scenes on the Blu-ray or DVD,
Sure.
but now they don't really do that.
Yeah.
And like I remember most recently it was Disney Plus's Hawkeye series where they actually released about I'd say nearly like 15 minutes of deleted scenes on Disney Plus,
Wow.
and it was very shocking because they rarely do that with any of their shows. And I think it's an interesting thing. I really like to watch deleted scenes, but it's
Yeah.
at this point where I mean, as you said, it's like the Mona Lisa. The art is what is released for
Like the artist
that's the
presented
purpose. Exactly. So
and they're
it's yeah.
it. So
Yeah, so I mean, when we'll start with The Last of Us right now, but when we get more into it, I do have a couple questions regarding like whether the runtime affected it, and what might be what might be there that we might not see. But The Last of Us, let's just get into it.
sure.
How did you get the gig? How did you get involved with The Last of Us?
I was incredibly lucky in this. And, getting jobs is a combination of insane luck, timing, and in the end, keeping the job is about your own work ethic and talent, I think. Getting it sometimes can be different. But in this case, I feel like a lot of sort of events happened at the same time that brought me into the Last of Us world. I was lucky enough that my husband has been friends with Craig Mazin for
Mm.
many years. They're
Oh.
both writers, and Craig's a lovely person who just loves who he loves, and he's like, oh, let's have stupid dinner parties where we're going to eat or try to eat 70s recipes. Let's just do that one night. And so we would do those things, and so he would be a semi-frequent visitor. And when Chernobyl came out, I was just sort of like, Craig, so I guess you don't do comedy anymore. And he's like, well, no, I'm funny. I said, I know, I get it. I'm just saying, like, wow, this is kind of right up my alley, this kind of stuff. And if you ever do anything in the future, I know that you probably have 50,000 people who are going to be banging down your door, but I'd love to just make myself 50,001. And he said, yeah. Let's talk later. And when the whole sort of project was announced, we talked again, and schedules and protocols, etc., were kind of in the way of us working together. And then on Umbrella Academy, I was working with the director Jeremy Webb, who says to me, "I just got booked on The Last of Us, and I would really love it if you did it." And I was like, "Well, that's funny because I would really love to be doing it, and maybe we can call them and see if that's possible." And so we called, and unfortunately at the time they were all staffed up. And so what ultimately happened, I said, oh, that's fine. I understand this is how things work. I understand the schedules. I understand all the ways things work. But I'm in your back pocket. So just keep me in your back pocket. You never know when things happen. And it happened. And somehow another editor was on another project longer, and they had to drop out. And they called me and said, if you can be in Calgary in 3 weeks, then you have a shot. And so I interviewed for it, said, yes, I can be in Calgary in 3 weeks. And the first script that I was handed was episode 3. And
Wow.
and I'm just literally looking at it, reading it, and going, "Oh my God, this is beautiful writing." And now I'm terrified because, and everyone was looking at me and staring at me. Craig was nice about it. He's like, "Look what I gave you." I said, "Yeah, a heart attack, basically." Now I'm terrified, and everyone else like, "Just don't mess this one up. This is, don't mess it up." I said, "Okay, okay, I will do my best." And ultimately, it spoke to me personally. The script, as a middle-aged married gay man, as Craig is like it loves to call us, I felt so connected to these characters, and with that sort of life of having to have a secret language and a secret way of communicating before you could actually communicate in a very human way. And what I love about the writing and the performances was that they were incredibly recognizable as human and not as any kind of sort of like, oh, this is how gay relationships are, and this. I'm like, no, these are very human relationships. These all make sense to everyone. But the thing that I really enjoyed sort of illuminating was that sort of initial connection between them and how each one kind of was. Well, for example, I think Frank knows from almost the beginning that there's something up with this character, Bill, and Bill is trying desperately to hide his feelings and attraction to this person. So I would search through the film that was beautifully directed by Peter Hoare and photographed by Evan Bolter, um, and those performances were there. And I would basically create them, enunciate them, and make sure that they were visible. Versus sometimes, those things can get hidden in dialogue. And I said, no, this is about these sort of silent beats where the characters are not saying what they're really feeling. And I feel like the audience wants to follow along with each character in terms of, and not always both characters, but in this specific instance, it was an incredible ability to show both perspectives within the same scene, actually, of how each one was approaching the other one. Murray, Bartlett's character Frank, is approaching Bill with a little bit of kid gloves, but then he sort of jabs him to see like, oh, can I get you to actually be a little bit more specific? And Nick Offerman's character of Bill is trying to hide who he really is, but at the same time he can't deny it. And it's he's been out there for years and hasn't seen anyone, and this is such an incredible moment, and that he gets to meet someone who's like him, but he's never experienced this. And so having knowledge of that feeling and strong memories of how that is, I loved being able to help sort of illuminate those moments.
Now, when you mentioned that will you get the film that for at least episode 3, but when you get any of the episodes, like how does this process work as an editor? Because do you get the entire episode first, or because I'm kind of thinking of like films and other forms, even TV, the way that network television used to work, where you would have um, say half the season filmed, then they go back and film the other half. Like how does, at least for The Last of Us, how's your process work on that?
Oh, I mean, it's pretty similar for almost everything, and it's a function of money, it's a function of time, it's a function of needs. But I'm there filming when they start filming. I'm there, and no matter what. And the next day, whatever was filmed the day before, and I also edit all of it in that day. So I am, in theory, going to be caught up every day to one day behind what they're filming. And that's pretty true for almost everything. On network television, you have approximately 5 weeks to do an hour-long show from start to finish. I mean, we're talking like beginning of filming to sound mix. It's very fast. It's a very fast process, which is good because it trains you to make decisions quickly. But basically, for the first, and so Last of Us was a nice, was a healthy shoot. They had a healthy shoot. They were there for almost a year to film the 9 episodes, and I was able to basically have a cut of that first episode within 5 days after they wrapped that episode. And so then I turned that cut into the director of that episode. And then the director of that episode was given approximately it was a week and a half to 2 weeks, which is longer than normal. Most directors usually only get, I believe, the Guild says you get 4 days to make a cut, which is very quick on a 1 hour series, very fast. And so then the director will work with me without anyone else's input, no producers, no writers, no input, and they will craft what they feel is the episode that they would like to present to the producer, showrunner, writer. And at the end of that period, then the director will submit their cut, and then the producer, writer, showrunner will then view it, and then they now are in charge of making the episode that they want to make. And once they're completely happy with what they want to present, then it goes to the financing studio. In our case, it's HBO. And in some cases, if you're doing network, you go to, say, Warner Brothers Television. That's the financing studio. And then maybe the show is actually on ABC, the network, versus Warner Brothers is a different company. So then after Warner Brothers is happy with it as the financing studio, they say, yeah, we like this, maybe change this, maybe change that. Then it goes on to that network. And that network can say, oh, this and that, we want to add this and that, we want to do this, we're going to tie into that, blah, 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 blah. Can you make these little minor adjustments? And by that point, they will then picture lock you and say, okay, you're good to go. And then the process of building the sound effects for the sound mix and the music composition happens. Because you don't want to do that until you have a lock picture, because then you're going to be redoing and redoing and redoing. So you want to give your creative partners in that stage, the most finished product as possible. And that's how it all happens. So when I'm working, and then you just start doing it all over again when you get the next episode that comes in.
Now, I was listening to the Last of Us podcast, and Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann were discussing the fact that the original pilot of the series was essentially 2 episodes, and that the original cut was really I think it was mainly focused on Sarah, and then you had the 20-year jump. Now, what was, when you edited that, did you originally, you had I would assume it would be like, what, an hour-long version of just the pre-outbreak,
Right.
Or during the outbreak, actually, but that episode, is that how it works? So how did that happen? Like, did you, since you were talking about how you had the cut like 5 days later, you had this other version of the show, where did it end? Where was the shall I say, where was the credit sequence?
Of course, and Craig and Neil have talked about this, so I'm just repeating what they've said. And they said we're lucky enough to have really great partners at HBO who recognize that the end of the original pilot, which was kind of, I'm not, hopefully not spoiling anything for people, but if you haven't seen the pilot, I'm sorry. Turn off now. So Sarah dies, and so you have a child has died, and then you get this other kid in the quarantine zone. So they gave a little quarantine zone, sort of thing, and then that child dies, and you introduce Joel in the quarantine zone, and that's the end of the episode. And it's like, oh, that's a downer. That's a double downer. That's like really sad. And their belief was, we're not sure people will want to come back after seeing this. And this is people who haven't played the game, and that's really important, because people who haven't played the game, they don't know, who's coming. They don't know that Ellie is there. So it was this sort of thing where everyone was very wise, and they all got together and they said, we need to create something else and build something that wasn't scripted. And they had this second episode where Ellie is introduced, and we found all together, we found a way to create a version of the pilot that worked to combine those two things. And it was really, my gosh, it was really intense, but it was really interesting to see how malleable the film is. how you can move things around and you can delete certain things that you don't need, um, and really recreate something that did not exist on anyone's plate. And I am really proud of how it turned out. But yes, it was a combination of two different things.
Yeah, because like when I'm as a viewer watching that episode, I would never know that this was originally two episodes. It really does feel like one compact episode. And I think what's interesting too is how you have these cold opens, at
Mhm.
least in the first two, but mainly the most notable one um being that you the one that you worked on, which is episode one with John Hannah's character and the whole um ooh, could this actually happen? And I think that's a really interesting way to start the episode. Now, when you're in the editing room, are you aware of the title sequence that you have to edit into like the aftermath of that? How much does the beginning of the episode have to, I think, lead into the title sequence? Because that's something I've always wondered when it comes to these shows. Is it in the script that the title sequence is at a specific point, or is it something that you can kind of work around?
Good question. And sometimes the title sequence is written in, sometimes it's not. And I think to the great wisdom of Craig and Neil, and they've spoken about this. That opening talk show was not the original opening, and it was filmed right near the end of the production schedule, as sort of like we need a better opening, and we need to figure out a way to contextualize this fear and this dread that's about to happen. And I think that in that situation, putting people talking about it versus sort of seeing, like there was originally, they've said there was like a documentary that, like a Planet Earth style documentary that was sort of showing what happens to ants, but it was not as scary as hearing someone talk about how it could happen to people. Because there was that, again, it's the idea that what you don't see is scarier than what you do see, which is, goes back as, forever. Jaws, of course, famously utilized that. And it was similar here. It's like you set the parameters, you set the sort of the idea that something might happen. And then you sort of show a bunch of people in a circumstance where there's something happening and you're not sure, and you're going, whoa, is this what they talked about? And having that title sequence immediately after what they said gave you that sense that this fungus uh, was going to start to create this sort of this horrible pandemic, that decimates the world. So putting it there made sense, and it contextualized the entire experience in a way that if you just opened it with Sarah and you didn't know anything, you would just sort of follow her without having any other emotion attached to that. But by
Mm.
putting that first, you have this emotion of fear for her from the beginning. And so you do not have you have that. So then each moment has this extra sort of like feeling of dread for her, even though the scenes themselves are not dreadful at all. They're having breakfast. They're having eggs in their teeth and whatnot. They're talking to Tommy. But in the deep down in your sort of like your animal brain, you're going, what's gonna happen? When it's gonna.
You
So
feel the tension, you really do. And I remember when I watched that first episode, I I watched it with my dad. He had never played the game, and we were like just like I mean, especially seeing the plane as you see that one shot of the planes, and then like you have another shot where you have the classroom setting,
yeah,
which um I don't know, like personally for me, I'm more scared of crowded areas in movies or shows, or when
yeah,
it's daylight outside. When
yeah.
it's nighttime, it's kind of like, oh, that is traditionally where you're supposed to be scared, but I think the true terror is when you don't expect it, and that's usually in the daytime when you have, say, a classroom setting, or when you have just in that one shot of the neighbors and just trying to feed the grandmother. It's like this is something that is something you wouldn't expect to happen, but it does.
Yeah, feeding her biscuits of all things.
Yeah. And I what I really also love about that sequence is it's focused on Sarah the entire time. It never leaves her sight, and I would assume that was in the script beforehand. But when you're cutting that sequence, is there a lot more of Sarah that we didn't see, or are you saying to yourself, I want to focus primarily on what we need to capture in this moment? But how did you what was something that you really took from that experience of just that opening?
No, and you sort of hit it on the nail. Hit it on the nail. That doesn't make sense. Put the nail on the head. All right, that's better. And that is that like the whole purpose of that first section was to make the audience feel, and because Nico Parker is so lovely and
Oh,
so wonderful and so connected with Pedro, that it was easy to do in a way, but it was also difficult because you have Pedro as the star of your series, and I'm desperately cutting these sequences to make sure that the audience is seeing the scenes through her point of view. Every emotion that she has is more important than the emotions that Pedro has. And the scene I really love about the Sarah and Joel character is when she gives him the watch that she's fixed. And it's one of my favorites because it really was about following her emotions through that scene. And Pedro's barely in it. He really is. He's barely in it. You're seeing him from the side angle a lot of times because it's what she sees. And it's how she cares about him. And it shows you how much she is almost the parent that he isn't. It's like, oh, I knew you weren't going to do it for yourself, so I did it for you, And he's like, oh, I forgot to do this, I forgot to do that, I didn't do that, I didn't bring you the cake, I didn't X Y Z. I'm not good. He's not good at that. He's taking it for granted in a way that he's just so busy and so out of it that he's not focusing on what's right in front of him, which is this girl who just wants to give him a nice birthday and looks out for him. And that to me was the scene where you really just care so much about her, and it was all about her wanting to see him happy, and I wanted the audience to see her want to see him happy. So I wanted to follow her eyes as he opened the thing, and then to look at him when he says he likes it, and then he turns away at one point and says thank you, and then there's this little smile on her face that I thought was so important because it says, oh my God, I did the thing I wanted to do for my dad, and I got him the thing, and he doesn't say thank you, and he's emotionally a little bit more closed off. So when he says thank you, he doesn't look at her to say thank you. He looks away and says thank you, and that's a huge sort of it's an in to his. He probably has never said that, for a while because he's been just so focused on his job, focused on everything else, and trying to be that protector and caregiver and or caretaker and whatnot, that he just doesn't see this little moment as that she in the same way that she does, and she's very proud of it. And I think that's an emotion that a lot of people connect to, is seeing how you do a good thing for someone, they recognize it, and then you get to enjoy that sort of recognition with them. And then of course we immediately have the joke about stay up and watch this movie with me, and she's like a kid again and falls asleep. So she has this wonderful sort of I don't know, not experience, but like she's just very emotionally more open than he is at this point. So and showing that to the audience, I think really helps when the inevitable happens.
now, have you played the Last of Us video game?
Great question. Here's the fun part. No, I have not, and I have still not. Um,
Have when you went to work on this project though, did you watch any videos on it? Did you like go in cold where you kind of just treated this like any other show?
Completely cold. We
Mhm.
recorded the cutscenes. They said, "Oh, you can watch the cutscenes," and I'm like, "Ugh, I don't want
Yeah.
to." And it was a gamble, honestly, because I said to myself earlier, I said, "Well, here's the thing, like." and I've done this before, and I learned this about 10 years ago. I worked on this show called Believe, and it was on for like no time at all. But it was with Alfonso Cuarón and J.J. Abrams, and one of JJ's producers, this guy named Brian Burke, said to me, he's like, "Do not read the scripts." And I said, "Well, whoa, why not?" And he goes, "You need to be as open to whatever comes in as possible." And I said, "Well, but if I don't know what's coming," he goes, "That's exactly where you should be. If you don't know what's coming, you can have an honest opinion about the material." And I took that with me for now over a decade, almost a decade actually. Um, and I applied it here because I said, you know what, that might be the way to do this. That might be the way to do this, is to not know anything. And luckily, my assistant editor, Emily Mendez, who's now going to be co-editor on the next few episodes with me, because she's tremendous as well. And I also couldn't do them all without her. She knew the game really well, and she was ecstatic about working on it and said, "I know the game. I love the game. It's one of my favorite games. I've played it many times. Left Behind is my favorite thing in the world." La 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 la. And I said, "Okay, great." So she was always the first audience to every scene, and then she would say, "Oh, that's like the game." And I said, "Oh, what? What's like the game?" And she would say, "When you're following behind Joel here, that's what the game feels like." And I said, "Oh, no way." And I said, "That's cool." So I was coming to things in an independent way, and then she would slightly adjust my point of view here and there, but she never would say like, "You should do it like that." But it was just like she would point out like, "Oh, that gives me game vibes," basically. And so I turned in the cut not having played the game, and so it was a fresh sort of perspective on it, because I kept saying I have to protect the many people, and probably maybe even more, that don't have any experience with this game. I have to do it as though it's fresh and completely new to them. And what was nice is that Emily and Craig would then later go, "Oh yeah, love the scene. Can you do me a favor? There's this one shot that I did that is just like the game." Uh,
Mm.
and there's a specific instance I can give you is, you know, when Ellie says your watch is broken, and in the pilot, I had it in like a shot of her saying it to him, and he's like, "Ugh." So, and he's like, "No. I really would love to see that in this one shot where her legs just cross in front of her, because it was a really impactful moment for me in the game, and I would like to replicate that shot in this specific instance." But he said, "But everything else is great." And when I actually looked at that cutscene, I recognized that I had cut the dialogue of those two characters in a completely different way. I had made them really sharp and overlapping with each other, so they were fighting a lot more. And when I looked at the cutscene, they would pause between everything, and in a way that was like a little bit more. There was a lot more space between their argument, and I did the opposite. I did it as though it was like what I would consider a normal argument that I would have with anyone, which is like nobody stops to wait for other people to talk. Um, in a game setting, that might have made more sense, but in this setting, it made sense to me for those two characters to be sort of like battling for not supremacy, but battling for the upper hand, the last word, and leave me alone. And no, I'm not going to leave you alone. So in that specific instance, my lack of knowledge of the game gave the scene sort of a freshness that it might not have had I had seen the scene and said, "Oh, I should cut it like this," and replicate exactly what they did. And so more often than not, I'm shocked to say that I would come to very similar decisions that Neil Druckmann would come to in the game, and a lot of that I think is because he's such a cinematic person that those decisions in the game, when I would see the same daily of that, like the long shot of that, I would say, "Oh, that's a really great piece," and I would take it out and put it into the sequence because it made cinematic sense in the same way that it did in the game.
And I think that's really interesting because you also can operate as the viewer that hasn't played the game. You can kind of go in there and it doesn't feel like, oh, you can only enjoy this show if you play the game. You
Like,
clearly can add your own adaptations. You really do need that because the majority of viewers probably won't be the ones that play the game, especially in the future when it becomes, as right now we're seeing, the biggest show on TV. So I think that's a really interesting insight. Um, and I mean, personally, as someone that has played the game, like I've started my replay of the game because
Cool.
I played the game a couple of years ago for during, believe it or not, the pandemic happened, and I was like, what a perfect time to play The Last of Us.
Exactly.
And I played it, and then of course I played Last of Us Part Two, and I just love how like the beginning of the show really does, it feels like you're watching the game, but at the same time it feels new. It doesn't feel like it is beholden to the game. It feels like it is clearly honoring the game,
Yeah.
but as we get to episode 3, we start to see how it really truly feels like its own beast, its own creation.
Yes.
And I love that.
And I'm so happy to hear that because that was the goal. It was again, it was daunting and terrifying to just be like, this might fail, but it also I just felt like these characters in this story that I'm seeing in front of me are so interesting and unique, and I'm able to see the dramatics within the scenes, and those dramatics were very recognizable to me. They were very, in my mind, universally recognizable to what I would think the audience would react to. So the ability, I'm just really grateful for that ability to have done it in such a way that it seems to be pleasing. Not all gamers, and you can't please everybody. So, and there's a very lovely minority of folks that did not like episode 3, and I understand. I don't understand that perspective, but I just I understand that people are going to be mad, and even if it's just because they wanted those gameplay moments with Ellie and Bill and these things. I'm like, okay, I get that, but I didn't know about those gameplay moments at all when I did it. I had no idea. So I just was like, this is what's in front of me, and this is one of the most beautiful things that I could imagine putting together. So, and that's why we did it.
Going to episode 3, I think what I really was impressed with at least the editing and pacing of that episode was that I actually went into episode 3. I knew that would be a Bill and Frank centered episode. I didn't like it wasn't like I was late to the party on the episode. I knew that going in. I remember they released photos of
Yeah,
both
yeah,
Nick Offerman and Murray Bartlett, and I was like, okay, this is probably just gonna be a Bill and Frank episode. I was shocked that Joel and Ellie were even in the episode, and I think you did an incredible job at making it where it was truly, a Bill and Frank episode, but you had found ways where Ellie and Joel could appear and the story could, truly impact those characters. Where I feel there was, there could have been an alternate world where that episode was edited by someone else, and it may have felt like we spent too much time with Joel and Ellie as opposed to Bill and Frank. And I think you did a perfect job at keeping them, I think, at the right length. Now, when you edited it, did you worry, oh, am I spending too much time with Joel and Ellie? Am I spending too much time with Bill and Frank? What did you have? Did you ever have those questions?
Um, really, really, that's a really good one. And here's the truth: is it was such an embarrassment of riches on all fronts, and that's what made it sort of terrifying. Because I knew when I put the first cut together, and I'm like, this is long, but I don't hate any of it. So I can't. And my process of editing, my process, not everyone's, but my process of editing is I like to do the very best version of everything that the director shot, and I will put every beat in that the director filmed, that the actors did, so in a way that feels like it could, if it needed to, it could go onto the air, and people would be like, okay, that was a little long, but it was good. So, and it felt like a show. That said, I prefer having the director and the producer see everything and say, "Oh, that's good, but we don't need that. This is not necessary, so we can extract that." And so instead of going, "What do we have here?" I say, "Well, here's what you have in what I think is its best sort of form, and now we can start chipping away at it." So it's a process of subtraction versus a process of digging. And digging is always like this, like, well, what else do we have? And I'm like, uh-oh, now we're going to get nervous because now we don't think we have it. And now we're going to try and create something that may not be as organic as possible. Whereas I like to try and solve those problems from the beginning as the editor and say, I'm going to solve as many problems as I can. If I think there are problems up front, present to you the best version of what I think that you're looking for. Doesn't mean I'm going to be right. And there have been many times where I've been wrong. And then I will change everything, and that's okay too. But that's kind of the way I did it. So with those characters, we were aware that there was a lot of story to be told with Bill and Frank, and they were the heart of the episode. So most of that stuff is exactly as it was because we didn't want to trim any of that nuance and that subtlety. And then the Joel and Ellie parts were so fantastic up front because it was about them sort of talking for the first time as a pair versus before they were just stuck together and Tess was there, but once Tess is gone, now they're stuck, and so it has to be about them. And I feel the audience wants to see how they're going to interact. And for the very end of the episode, I think that the critical thing, and you touched on it, and I think hopefully this will track with you, is that when she's reading that letter about about what type of a man Bill was, and he says to Joel, these are the type of people that we are. We protect others. That's who we are. And my choice from the get-go was as soon as she starts reading about that, I saved the super close shot of Joel for that moment. I saved it. And I said, I'm going to only use it here, and I'm going to have him react to that entire line. And Pedro, being an incredibly nuanced and subtle performer, found all of those microbeats in his eyes. I literally watch his dailies like this.
Wow.
Like watch his eyes. So I'm constantly looking at his eyes because his eyes are telling me so much about how he's feeling. The windows to his emotions are back there, and so that's how I did it. So in that specific moment, when he says, and goddamn any mother effers who will get in our way, trying to be clean for your podcast, my friend. And it's all about the Joel's feeling that he has failed to be that person in that moment, because he says there was one person worth saving, and I did, and I protected him, and I did this, and so we're on Joel that entire time going, and I didn't protect her, and my daughter's dead, and here I am 20 years later having to listen to this guy say I did what I was supposed to do and that the two of us are the same person. And then the ultimate sort of jab is he says, so now I'm going to give you all of my protection that I have, that I use to protect Frank, and I'm giving it to you because you need to protect Tess. And that's and I didn't do that either. So what am I? And he can't, and he has to go outside and read the letter and then just crumples it up. And then at that moment, a decision has to be made as to whether or not he's going to just tell this girl, I'm out of here, I can't do this. Or, okay, maybe you can come with me. So, and that to me was the critically emotional part of that, to see him in that beat, as opposed to seeing Ellie read the letter, which was great. And seeing her do the he was really important because that was fantastic. But I wanted to focus it on Joel and how he was processing what she was saying.
And I think that then when we get to the car sequence, when they get in the car, that is definitely a progression of that moment where we're starting to see, as you mentioned earlier with that episode, we're seeing the seeds being planted of now Ellie and Joel being just a unit. But really, when we get to the end of that episode, when they're in that car, that is when I think we really start to truly see that Joel, he now is going to protect this child no matter what. And when we get to the next episode, which is episode 4, which just was released this Sunday, I think the best part of that episode is revolved around the fact that now Joel and Ellie are finally really forming this friendship, which calls back to the very end of episode 1 with Deepak Mode's song, which is a ride, Never Let Me Down, which is I'm taking a ride with my best friend. So
Sure,
I
yeah.
think that it's so, and I mean, Pedro and Bella's performances, them together. I mean, as an editor, it's like I can only imagine how you probably feel at times guilty of cutting anything out that they do, because it's unbelievable what they're accomplishing with their performances.
And they care so deeply for each other that it really does help. And when in the early episodes when they have to be sort of snarky with each other and distant, it's fun because that's not how they are with each other. They're wonderfully vibrant and full of life after action, after cut, and before action. And then when they go into the characters, it's so fun to watch. And you're right, it's an embarrassment. And I will say that probably my favorite scene is in this previous episode when he taught her how to use the gun. And you're the first person I'm telling this to, actually. That is the only scene in my whole career that I started over on. I have never started over on a scene before, and I did the scene the first time, and I said, it's good, but it's not good enough, and I just don't think I've given it everything that I should be giving it. It's a major, major point, and I feel like I need to give these characters another shot. So I started over and I watched all the film all over again, and I put the other scene aside because, of course, on an Avid and digital editing, you can do that. Thank God. And I started over, and certain things did land back in from that original cut, but not. But a lot of it did not, and I had a completely fresh perspective on it and redid it. And when I was done with it, I said, "Now that's giving these characters the due that they need, because they have done something in this scene, which is such a tightrope act, which is I'm gonna care and trust this person who I shouldn't trust or care for, and I'm going to accept." And Bella's saying, "I'm going to accept this parental feeling that I probably have never had in my life, and I should be completely in love and completely." And she is. She goes from, my favorite is, she goes from crying about what happens within the same shot. I made sure I didn't want to cut, to see her crying, to getting herself back together, to smiling, and then to being cool, all within the same shot. So you could see how Bella was able to navigate those emotions. So in my mind, I was like, well, that's magic right there. She can go from full on tears to badass, and then go through all the emotions in between in the course of a single shot. And then by the end, as you know, he's like, don't you dare put it in your pocket. You got to put it in your backpack. And what does she do? What does she do? She just doesn't listen, and she puts it
Yeah.
right. She puts it right back in her coat pocket. So
I
it
really do think Bella, like I've seen both her performances in Game of Thrones and in His Dark Materials, and I
yeah,
think in this is I love when we see progressions of like evolutions of actors and how you can see one go from one role to the other, and I truly think that Ellie is a role that Bella's really come into her own with this performance, because it's something that, as someone like as I've seen in His Dark Materials and Game of Thrones, like I see a true actor really finding their footing and really I want to say improving, but really kind of becoming even more of the actor that I think we'll see Bella become in the future, which
my God, I mean, I don't want to make it crazy for her, but like I'm like she could be the next Meryl Streep. She's that good, that good, and I just I mean, it's a joy. It's a absolute joy to see her do these things, and she's a absolutely wonderful individual as well. It just sort of makes it all like, okay, and I just bow to her and to Pedro for their sort of ability to tell this story in a way that's, again, respectful to the experience of the game, but have their own sort of emotional weight brought to it. And it's just, in my mind, those two can do no wrong. Except maybe on SNL, Pedro might have broken a few too many times, which was hilarious. Um, and that was,
It's a me, Mario.
and I'm it's a me and Mario, but my favorite, of course, was the steak table incident. Um, but that is so. And it's that you can see the joy that those individuals have, and I think that as an editor, my job is to reflect their inner joy or whatever emotions they're experiencing at that time, is to sort of prism that to the audience so that they too can feel that similar feeling um, with them. And with them, I get to look at gold every day. So how can I be upset?
Dude, and you get to look at when it comes to like even episode 3 that I mean it's been reported it's the original cut was originally almost 2 hours long, where I can't imagine, Nick Offerman, Murray Bartlett. You did say you didn't really cut much from what was
No,
there,
no,
but of course, Pedro and Bella. Like, there's a number of performances in that episode, probably that you get to see that sometimes we might not get to see because they are not in the finished one, which is
they're on the edge of the Mona Lisa. No, I'm not going to go.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not going there. No, this is. I'm honestly, I'm super humbled that people love this because every single person on this crew was dedicated 1,000% to this story, and that says everything about Craig's script. That he wrote this incredible story, and that everyone got on board and said we need to bring everything that we are to this story, um, from everyone down the line. And when that happens, and again, I said I had an embarrassment of riches in the episode, and so there was so much in it. But again, like, my job is also to work with other people to say how can we efficiently tell this, and maybe there's a piece of film where I don't need to see Murray Bartlett get up from his chair at the dining table, walk over to the mantelpiece, and then put his little finger on it to see the dust on it. Maybe there's a way where I can cut from him looking at the mantelpiece and then lose about 10 seconds to just cut to him over at the mantelpiece so the audience knows he's looking at something. But then I can say, oh, he's looking at that. And then he does this, which tells you, so this guy sees that, I have a purpose here too. This place is dirty. I need to be able to clean this place. As opposed to seeing the whole thing in real time of him, moving back, getting up, walking over, camera adjusting, etc. So it's my job to know and to hopefully know what the audience wants to see at a given time, and to make them not necessarily have to wait to see it, because a lot of times you want things to be close together. And one of the things that I feel like really worked in the sort of the process of the creative sort of bringing it down to the runtime was certain things stuck out to us as sort of creative individuals, things that I always look for in the photography and in the direction, which was at the end of the Bill and Frank storyline. There is a shot of them that the camera is static, which is, I think, one of the only times that the camera is ever static in the entire episode, which was by design. And they're going down the hall, and there are these two candles at the end that are lit of that hallway. And when Joel and Ellie come in to that house, the director purposefully had the door opening from the candle's perspective, and the candles had melted down. And those two images had to be as close to each other as possible in order for them to have any kind of resonance. Otherwise, if they were, say, 15 minutes apart, you wouldn't remember that they were candles. So a lot of it was seeing these sort of connective tissue pieces and going, oh my gosh, this has so much sort of poetic value that these candles were lit, but now that they're not, they've melted all the way down, and it tells you so much about what happened, where we are. It tells you the sort of the when, the where, the who, and then emotionally it has a gravitas to it that you can't predict, as opposed to them like coming into the door and seeing them walk in. So using that as sort of a basis, we try to do as much sort of elegant truncation as possible.
I was looking at a Twitter thread that you were doing a couple of days back where you discussed the idea that you want to refrain from some jump cuts in the episode 3 where we have more of like a oneer and we have more of Murray's character Frank running out to see what's going on, and how as you're looking at a scene like that, what is going through your head and what you want to keep and what you want to refrain from doing.
Yeah, no, really good question. And one of the things I was saying was like during the process of sort of truncation, I would look at that oneer shot of Frank as he was exiting the house with the gun that Ellie finds later, and following him up to the point where you see Bill, um, and go, oh my God, there's Bill out there, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say, well, maybe there's a way that I can just sort of get rid of him walking over to the window and this and that, so that maybe there's ways to truncate this oneer. But at the same time, I kept saying to myself, this was designed, and it was designed for a very specific reason. It was designed for the reason of being with the character of Frank. And so as soon as you cut, I am now removing the audience from the character of Frank, and I'm going sort of in an objective space and saying, I am pushing you through the scene. And therefore the cut, the specific edit, is actually going to harm the story, because what it's actually doing is it's relieving the audience of having to experience exactly what Frank is going through. And a lot of the importance of that was to have the sound of the outside world had to feel dangerous, had to feel scary, had to feel like you don't want to go there. So again, it was this sort of, it generated this fear in the audience by enduring the shot with him. So in that instance, I could not find a way to make any kind of what I call propulsive edits, or not jump edits per se. Jump cuts are sort of a slightly different thing, but anything where I could propel the story. Like at one point I tried to like have him come down, go over to the window, and then have him immediately open the drawer and catch the gun. But then for whatever reason, I was like, but now I feel like I'm like hanging a lantern on the gun. I don't want to hang a lantern on the gun, because I want the gun to just sort of be an organic thing that happens, so that later on when you see the gun in the scene where Ellie catches it, you go, right, of course, because he went over and opened the door, as opposed to he opens the door and you might be missing it because you turned away at that very moment. You might have missed it. And so I don't want anyone to miss it. And that's sort of a long-winded answer, but in a way, there's a tension to not editing that is more powerful than editing.
And that is also, I think, another example of like how you build the tension in the scene, where when you have a shot like that feels different from the other shots, it makes the audience say to themselves, wait, this is different. Something's about to happen here. And like going to episode 4, when you have that sequence where Joel and Ellie are in the car and they crash into the building, and you have that whole moment where the young kid, I shall say, that tries to kill Joel, and then Ellie shoots him. That moment's also another tense sequence. Mm-hmm. And I do wonder, when you're considering a moment like that compared to the moment in episode 3, are you saying to yourself, as a editor, do I want to make it look different from the last like sequence that we did in episode 3? Do I want this sequence to feel different from episode 1? How do you, when you cut these sequences, are you kind of mindful of what you did in the earlier episodes that you might not want to do again?
Not really. But it's an interesting question, and I can answer it in a different way, which is I am always mindful of the film that was shot and the story that's being told in a specific room. And if it has echoes to something prior, I go, oh, interesting. I'll give you an example. Ellie in this last episode says, you are losing it big time, when he says, I'm losing it, when he starts laughing at the end. Now, in the pilot, that scene was filmed later with Tommy, and he says he's losing it to Sarah at the end of that scene. That was ad-libbed.
Oh, yeah.
And he says he's losing it, and she smiles. And that, I recognized, was something that was important to put into the pilot, because then it's going to resonate later. That when Ellie says, he says, I'm losing it, which is what Tommy had said to Sarah 20 years ago. and then she says, "You're losing it big time," that has echoes. So I think, and I'm always about like the 17 times someone watches it, someone's going to catch these things. I hope, or else I'm just insane, which is also possible, which is okay. But in terms of that specific sequence with the boy Brian, who Ellie shoots, it was important to me to use editing to do the following, which is number one, hide the gun until I have to see the gun. There was, of course, the shot of her. She opens the backpack, she pulls out the gun, she goes to the hole, she goes out the hole, you see the gun, etc., etc., etc. And I was like, well, if I show the gun too soon, then it's like there's no tension at that point because you're going, oh, there's a gun involved. So when is she gonna shoot the gun? Versus the way I wanted to cut it was she gets the idea after flicking the switchblade. And the switchblade is a great cut anyway, because it's like that signature sound for her, that signature thing that's like, this is how I fight. I fight with the switchblade. But then she remembers, oh, wait, I have a gun. But you only see the moment of recognition on her face. And that's it. And so I said, it's going to be interesting, hopefully, for the audience to go, what's she thinking? And then you see her come out, and you don't see the gun. Then you just see her shoes walking towards him. Like, well, why is she walking towards him? Why? So for those 5 to 7 seconds, the audience is asking themselves, hopefully, or I'm in trouble. What's she doing? Why is she doing that? And then you cut to her face, and then the gun comes into frame, and you go, oh shit, she took the gun. Of course she did. And if you knew the gun was there, it's still tense, in my opinion, because you want your theory to be validated. You don't want to know right away. You want it to be validated. And so I validated the theory as soon as it became important to the story for you to know that she had it. And that's one of the things that drove that sequence. That sequence was really hard to cut, actually, really difficult. We had so many interesting performances from the character of Brian, many different takes, many options. He was sometimes cooler about it. He was like more chill about it. No, don't kill me, don't kill me. But in the end, we felt like, the guy who started out as this sort of warrior turning into this child was more impactful to see Ellie having done that, and to see him immediately collapse into a child and beg for his mother, which took a lot of sort of finagling with the track, and also to make sure that entire sequence was from Ellie's point of view. Everything that happened was harrowing for her. So Joel, he's sort of in it a little bit, but it's mostly like how she sees Joel. So when he goes over to grab the gun, I'm not with Joel's face saying, give me the gun. I'm with a wide shot. So you see the physicality of him, towering over her saying, give me that gun. And then the only time I think I'm very close to him is when he says, get back behind the wall. And then we follow her. So we don't stay with Joel whatsoever. Only time I went back to Joel there was I wanted once again, he had done this in a previous scene where he wanted to make sure that she was through the hole before he did what he did. Because he was, in a way, he was protecting her from seeing what he's about to do. And so he just makes sure that, like, all right, she's gone. Now I have to do what I have to do. But you're not going to get to see that because it's scarier to not see things. Again, it's grounding the sort of the violence in the characters and the emotion versus seeing the violence as a presentation. And so hearing him be stabbed from her perspective and her having that gasp going, like, this guy just died because of me. And for her then to see her have to recover from that is all I care about in that sequence. And that was it. That was how I approached the whole thing.
It's also a nice, I kind of see it as a contrast to the opening of not the opening, but the end of the pilot episode where he kills that one Fedra guy, and you see her face and it's like, wait, like she's happy that someone finally has vouched for her and protects her, but you see that contrast, and I just love that character development there too, where we start to see bits and pieces of Ellie's kind of shell collapsing. And I mean, I haven't seen the future episodes, but I'm sure we'll get some more interesting stuff when it comes to Riley and when it comes to Storm Reeds. That's actually my most excited episode. Like whenever we get to that stuff, because like you said, Emily was mentioning how that like Left Behind's her favorite. I also I really love Left Behind. But I'm gonna finish off pretty soon with about a couple more questions. One of the questions, though, I want to ask you is I was noticing on episode 4, the very beginning when Ellie is working with that gun in the mirror and was seeing that, how much of that was like presented to you on film? Did you decide to cut like mid, because it's like it look the way it's shot and the way that we are introduced, it's like midway into the sequence of her in that mirror. Did you was there like a number of minutes prior to that that you just cut into?
Oh, that's a really good question. And honestly, it was the way it was kind of written, is that she's sort of there, um, and you're not sure for the first. And again, it was a similar sort of tactic, which is you see her in a mirror and you go, oh, dirty mirror. There's Ellie. What's she doing? And then she raises the gun into frame. New information. Oh, she's got that gun. That's right, the gun. Of course, that's what we're curious about. And at that point, it was about seeing her work with this weapon in a way that was she was trying to learn about it, but she was also, and I'm not the first person to say this. I think Neil has spoken about this. He's fascinated by this weapon, and it's a symbol of power. It's a symbol of how, and Craig has said, like, this is how people survive in this world, is with a weapon. And I remember hearing him say, like, without this, if she had this weapon, maybe things would have been different in, say, Left Behind. And so this is a very prized possession, but it's also it's a scary thing. And for any kid, it's like, you get you play with a little gun as a weapon. Everyone's done it, and you go, oh, you do the thing where you aim it, and then you like look through and you go, that makes sense. So seeing that sort of childlike behavior, sort of contrasted with this sort of girl who's got a little bit of a violent streak, was, I think, what made that scene interesting. And of course, it could have been a lot longer, and it was a lot longer. But I said, well, and they said, well, let's see if we can truncate this a little bit, but still keep the idea alive that she is doing things that she's sort of worshiping this weapon in a way. She's smelling it. She's like using the little spring in it. She's like learning how things pop out. Oh, it fell onto the floor. That's how that works. And sort of like, and again, it's presenting. It's Chekhov's gun. It's going to come back. So, and it sure did. So,
It's a very interesting way to open the episode because the first 2 episodes begin with cold opens.
yeah.
And then we're starting to see, at least from episode 3 and episode 4, they don't. They begin with the title sequences, and they don't have the cold opens. And I would assume there was never an intention to have cold opens in those episodes.
Yeah, I don't think so. It's
yeah,
like,
so
in a way, those cold opens, and I'm speculating. I don't know the answer here, but the way I felt about them is that the cold opens in those first 2 episodes were beautiful indications of how the rest of us experienced this outbreak, and it was able to remove from the individual characters and to, again, contextualize the experience in the viewers' minds. So the first one you see is what could happen. Oh my God, what could happen? The next thing is, how did it happen? And this is how it did happen. So it presents how it did happen. And then there is no need to do any more, because at that point, the audience is fully contextualized as to, what could and what did happen. So any time you would step out of the sort of the point of view of the characters, I'm not sure what the use is, what the purpose is. And so maybe there's something in later episodes where you get to do that again, maybe not. But I think that was why the cold opens were as interesting as they were, because it allowed sort of Craig and Neil to step back a bit and say, let's contextualize this for the audience. So that, again, I always find that if people don't have enough information at the beginning of what's happening, where everyone is, who everyone is, then they can't relax into the sort of the emotion and the story of the characters. So to give that context up front, I think is, what kind of helps make it an enjoyable ride. and we're doing our darndest to give justice to these beautiful characters who obviously have made an indelible impact on so many people from the game, um, and to do it in such a way that also brings it to a brand new audience.
And like what you mentioned earlier about how, at least when it comes to the first episode, you really, when you see that cold open, it leads into Sarah. If you didn't have the cold open there, you wouldn't really feel the same emotions going into it as you would before. I think
Correct.
it's interesting because when it comes to like episode 3, even though there isn't a cold open there, you still are getting that semblance of what is going on pre-outbreak or during the outbreak with Bill as he's watching the Fedra and the government carry all these people away. And then even in episode 4, as you were mentioning with Ellie, you do have the gun, which kind of is the story of the entire episode, and how I think you see the gun works against her character and how it works against the relationship between Joel and Ellie. So it's really, I think, an interesting way of structuring the series, but also focusing on these characters. Um, but I think another interesting, at least editing technique I saw you utilize, and especially episode 3, you utilize fades a couple of times in the episodes where you're you're like, one of them, I believe it's them as Joel and Ellie are walking through the field, and there's like a fade around that point, and then there's another fade during like the Bill and Frank sequence, I believe.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
was that like, that was your design, right? That wasn't something that
yeah, and
was
it's
required.
funny. A lot of people are like, there's an old saying, if you can't solve it, dissolve it. And
Yeah,
that was not the case here. Um, Maybe one time, but it wasn't like I was trying to solve something. But I just somehow felt I was kind of inspired by Gustavo Santuai. I'm not going to say it right. Forgive me, everyone. Santoaya. So
that's
someone's going to
okay.
correct, and I welcome the correction. Thank you very much. Because I don't know how to say it exactly the way I did. Anyway, I was very inspired by his music, and something about his music and this specific episode had a very sort of, and to use the piano metaphor, had the feeling of soft pedal. And the use of piano music throughout the episode actually was important to me. That the sound of a piano connected them. There was a piece that they were listening to near the end of the episode that I chose for them to be listening to in the sequence where he can't open the pills and he's trying to feed him his pills. And it was a Chopin piece, and it was piano concerto because I said piano was the thing that brought them together. And in a deep way, in the background, if you hear the sounds of a piano in this soft pedal, it will create that connectivity between these two characters. And in the same way, like when Joel and Elliot and Bill and Frank are having these moments, they're very soft pedal moments. They're moving through space and they're moving through time. And in a way, I just sort of felt like a dissolve in this case made sense. I have many little tricky little dissolve techniques that I like using, and I've used them over the years. And but this one was like a very, it's almost like, I don't know. I'm obsessed with 70s movies, and I just like the idea of somehow making some kind of a homespun film. And a dissolve kind of sort of signifies that to me in a way. So I didn't fear the dissolve. A lot of people are like, if you dissolve, you're. I was like, nah, I think I'm okay here. So yes, I'm grateful that you recognize that, and that's one of the reasons why I love doing it.
And there's also a fade to black a couple times too, which is something that is in episode 4. I think I legit thought the episode was over, and I was saying to myself, because I think, if I recall, it's near the end of that episode. It's right. I think it's right before Sam and
Right.
Henry appear, and it's one of those things where I remember I was discussing with some of my friends. The episode is actually, I mean, it's not as long as episode 3, of course, but the way it's done, you're almost like, wait, it's over? Like, you're really so engaged in it, where I think that fade to black is interesting because it also, I think, represents just the fact that when they're going to sleep, it's almost to a point where we're starting to see, I think, them starting to really feel this journey, this
Connection.
moment.
Yeah,
Exactly.
he makes her laugh. I'm sorry, she makes him laugh. Reverse that. So yeah, she makes him laugh, and he has not smiled the entire time. So, and because of
Such a
that, you feel this
beautiful moment.
connection between them, and because they're and honestly, it was performance based. The reason why we did it is because they had this bit at the very end where the camera was moving away from them, and he says, "Go to sleep," and she said, "You go to sleep," and that was such a to me exactly what I would have said, and it was such a connective parent-child moment, and I really wanted it in there, and I'm like, well, the problem is if I do that, then and have it on camera, it only happened once. If I do that, then where do I go? Because now I can't just cut to them asleep because that would be very jarring. And in a way, jarring is used at times for those reasons, but this was another one of those soft pedal moments. So I said, well, you know what? Sleep kind of feels like that. Sleep feels like you suddenly are like, drifting, and then all of a sudden you're gone, and then you just wake up, and it's as though no time had passed. Um, and that was kind of the concept there was that it's the idea that you're drifting off to sleep. And I had to, of course, get those two mysterious characters who most people probably know exactly who that is, coming in for the very end. But that was the technique.
Yeah, it's really, I love seeing things, whether it's that type of technique, whether it's a dissolve where you start to get to see, the editor at play, because sometimes you might not notice, which is also a really great way to watch something where you don't notice something, but
Yeah.
you kind of get to see, your voice, your identity. Now, another interesting thing, this is going to be my last question revolving around The Last of Us,
Yep.
but I think it's interesting because when you look at, even like I think some of your Umbrella Academy episodes you've worked on that utilize music,
Oh yeah.
you have this where a lot of the episodes, episodes 1, episodes 3, episodes 4, at least the ones that we've seen, they all utilize music in them. And whether it's Deepak Mode's Never Let Me Down in episode 1, whether it is, in episode 3, I mean, you have Linda Ronstadt, you have,
Yeah.
Cream's White Room, and then you get to even episode 4,
Yep.
which utilizes Hank Williams'
Mhm.
Alone and Forsaken. Now, I wonder, how do you work around with those types of, musical moments? Are you choosing what to cut, when to say utilize that piece of music, where it ends, where it begins?
Great question. And here's where I will echo back to what I said a long time ago, and that everything in my career has led to this. And so when I first started editing, I was editing on the OC, and I was editing on Gossip Girl, and we had the most tremendous ability to work with music on those shows, and we had the most tremendous music supervisor and also tremendous musically gifted producers and writers who would give us these opportunities to stretch ourselves musically. And as someone who, as you know, I was very musically drawn in my formative years. Music is it really is the thing that I find so close to the work of an editor. And so using music to me is like akin to, I don't know, it's my favorite part of the process. Um, and I do all the temp music myself. I'm less good with sound effects. Luckily, I always have an assistant editor who's really good at them. And Emily Mendez, my assistant, former assistant, co-editor, was an expert at that. So the collaboration worked out. But so in terms of music, in sometimes you have a music supervisor who's helping you along, and we had that on this. So a lot of those tracks, like Linda Ronstadt, were chosen by other people. Certain tracks I put in as temporary, thinking, okay, well then someone else is going to fix this. I just needed, right now, because I need to fit. I need to make my day. Like this has been filmed the day before. I need to finish it in this day. I don't have time to wait for a song to sort of show up 5 days later because someone has curated it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes I'll just say to myself, all right, I'm going to cut the sequence, and then I'm going to throw a bunch of songs up against it and see which one has any kind of stickiness, as I like to call it, a little stickiness to it, like where they connect. And that's how, for example, the original montage of Bill's Town worked, because I was using the Fleetwood Mac, Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, I should make it clear, for that first montage. And it turns out that just sort of fit the character, or actually not the character, but the idea of who you thought the character was. And it was like this thing where it's like, okay, this is that kind of guy. This is the kind of guy who is a survivalist, as he calls himself, and he probably might listen to this kind of music. And the same went with Cream. And I worked on a show called Aquarius, as you know, which is a lot of '60s music, and that's where I was introduced to those songs.
Oh wow!
And that's where I again took from that experience and brought it here. And at the end of this last episode, I remember researching into sort of songs that The Last of Us had, like songs that would have stickiness, connectivity to Last of Us. And so that Lottie Kestner song, the cover of the New Order song, I was like, this is, again, perfect, because this was used a long time ago as like a trailer for the game, the second game, and it also had a lot to say about the episode itself. So I was lucky enough that when I put these tracks in, people would say, these are great, and we like them. So we would like to keep them. And my job, again, is also as an editor, as a music editor as well, in tracks like that. I had to make sure that they work, that they time out exactly the way they're supposed to time out, that they come in when they're supposed to come in. I'm lucky that, Craig has a really strong sense of how to use music in shows. So he's sort of given us his sort of a belief on how things are supposed to feel and to be used, but a lot of it is just me making sure that the sequence makes sense from a picture editing standpoint first, and then I will start throwing music up against it. Because I used to, and I think a lot of young editors will do this, and it's great, it's training wheels, is you cut to music, and the problem with cutting to music is you'll start to edit to the rhythm of the song as opposed to the rhythm of the story. And up front in your career, you kind of have to do that because you're still sort of getting your sea legs. And I did that all the time. But at a certain point, you start editing the picture as a rhythm and saying, all right, well, this leads to this, and this would lead to that. And Bill's going to drop that case of wine at just this moment. And I'm going to turn on this gas thing at just this thing. I'm going to propel him through this. I'm going to have this happen. And now I'm going to throw a piece of music up against it and see if the picture editing rhythm and the musical rhythms are starting to connect. And then sometimes it's like, oh, if I was just 2 frames off of this here, I could just move the picture just slightly to align with the way that the song sort of lands at that moment, things like that. So it's one of the most joyous things to do. And so working with all music to me is wonderful. And my little secret at the end of episode 3 is that where we chose that Linda Ronstadt song to start, and Craig was very specific about this, it was great. He wanted to hit at a certain point, and he wanted the lyric to hit at a certain point. And so we did all that. And then I realized that during the end credits, the song was going to go into the next verse, and the next verse is nice. But I was like, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could somehow hear what Bill sung in that piano version, what he sung in that very first sequence? And so I made a secret music edit that at one point it goes back to that verse. So the audience, while they're listening to the end credits, can actually hear Linda Ronstadt sing the portion of the song that Bill sung. And it's secret, and not anymore. But I love that because, again, I'm hoping that, people want to listen to the music at the end because they're waiting to see Craig and Neil and everyone discuss the episode, seeing what's going to come next week. And that gives them the opportunity to hear the version of those lyrics that Linda Ronstadt sung. And even though it's not exactly how the song goes, I didn't think it mattered. I thought it was more important for the audience to actually hear those words being sung.
So you do get to choose what song and how you're using it in the credits, because that's something that I'm very curious. Like, especially when you're having that, at least I'm thinking of episode 1, where it leads into the credits.
Yep.
There's a point in there where you get to actually have your say in how that goes, because you could cut it at one point in the song, but you could cut another point, but you actually get to you would get to choose where that goes.
And it's all based on the story. And that's really the truth is that made sense in that scene for the radio to flicks on, and the radio flicking on, meaning it's getting a signal, um, and hearing that song would have to start from the beginning because it's being triggered, and it's being triggered to start, and therefore the beginning of the song is the only thing that makes sense there. And it's being triggered because, of course, Bill and Frank have been dead for 7 days at this point, and that's the message. And they are not there for that message. So when they go down in episode 3 in the bunker and they say, "Why is the music playing here? Why is Erasure playing? It's 80s. Oh, 80s is trouble. Depeche Mode is an 80s song. That means trouble." So at the point where the Depeche Mode starts playing at the end of the pilot, Bill and Frank have been dead for 7 days. And in when they were listening to the Linda Ronstadt in the car at the end of episode 3, it only made sense to pick up that song in the middle of it because it was on a cassette tape. And so it could have been anywhere. They probably got home at a certain point and hit stop, and that's that. Clicked the tape out and left it the way it was. So it made sense to just come into it somewhere in the middle. And so we could line it up where, Craig was looking for it to line up. And I'm lucky that, they've allowed me to try my hand at, putting songs in for the credits. I have a pretty decent sort of feeling about how music and picture come together. And so I've been lucky enough in a couple instances that they've said, "Oh, that's good." And then in a couple instances, they're like, no, we have another idea. So, of course, Depeche Mode was Craig's idea from day one because he had a whole plan of that. But for sure, like it's nice to be working with people who are open to that kind of collaboration. And that's one of the things I think makes Craig such an incredible collaborator is that he wants other people to have their skill. And he wants them to bring themselves to any project, and then he knows that he gets to be the final arbiter. But he can say, "Hey, that's great. Let's do that."
That's I love hearing this. This is just so fascinating. Before I end it, I do want to ask you one last question, not Last of Us related, really, but would you have any advice for aspiring editors out there or anyone wanting to, get into this profession?
Absolutely. And that is edit as much as you can. And I know that seems crazy, but if you ever have the opportunity to edit anything, do it. I think there was like something on Twitter the other day where it's like someone released footage of some Bryan Cranston fight sequences in 4 cameras, and everyone's like, just rip those 4 images and start editing that and seeing how it works, because it's hard. Editing is really hard. I was no joke here. I was not great at it at first. I had an aptitude for it, but I had no craft. And I was mentored by a lot of great editors who basically said, okay, we recognize that in your brain is a passion. And you have all the right sort of like internal tools to do this, but you don't have any of the craft that goes into being an editor. And the only way you really get that is to do it over and over and over again, and to fall on your face and to get back up, fall on your face, get back up. And after a while, you know that you're about to fall on your face. And you go, no, I'm not going to go there. And then you start to write yourself as an editor. So, and my advice to anyone is, if you're thinking, how do I get a hold of material? That's something you can seek out. I'm sure that there are places that have footage available. I mean, in college we did the old Gunsmoke was given to us, which is such an super old school. But I'm pretty certain that there are places that have material to edit. Or, far be it from me to say, everyone has an iPhone. So, or some kind of camera phone. You've seen how a general scene works. Shoot something, write something, half a page, 1 page. Have a friend over, film them doing it, film yourself doing the other character. Try it a couple ways, and then try to edit it and see how it is. Because that's the only way you're gonna to figure out how to make that work, and to understand how to create the rhythms of conversation, and to see, oh my God, you had this great moment, but it was later in the scene. But if I moved it earlier, it would actually contextualize your response to what they're saying. And then you start to realize how things can move around, and you go, oh my goodness. So It's not what happened on the day that it was filmed. It's how I can utilize what was on the day and move it and shape it to what I'm looking for, as opposed to sort of like, sort of obsessively following what happened. You say, oh, well, whatever happened is pure and perfect and wonderful and beautiful. Your job as an editor is to enhance it. It is, or to leave it alone when you need to leave it alone, and you'll never know those things until you've done it. So all I can really say is, and if you get the opportunity to be a PA on a TV series, for example, I've had a couple of PAs do this to me. Like, can I stay late and watch you? Because I'm a night owl, so sometimes I'm there a little later than normal. Can I stay and watch you edit? And I'm not going to say no, because A, someone has had the courage to ask. B, my job as an editor is to help others understand the craft, um, if I can. And C, it helps me to explain what I'm doing. So it actually benefits me, and it benefits the other person. When I'm talking out the decisions I'm making, they can see how the decisions are being made, and then they're going to take that and figure out how to use that themselves. So, and if there's any opportunity to work with material that other people are working with, can I show you something? I don't want to get into your time. Editors can be very busy, but you sort of try and find people who are open to you showing them things. And we're out there. There's a lot of us. I teach at UCLA. I teach directors and cinematographers in the graduate program about editing. It's one of the classes they take. I've been doing it since 2008. Why? Because I care about other people understanding how they can actually enhance what their crafts are. And if I can do that for them, then it all works. And ultimately, don't we want to see better things? We just want to see things that work. And that's kind of my purpose, is to help share that information that's been shared with me. And that would be my advice, is to just edit whenever you can, and don't worry. Do not worry if it's bad, because it's going to start bad. It always does. And it will only get better. And that's just the way it works. Don't expect things to happen overnight. But if you're really passionate about it, just keep working.
That's perfectly sound advice. I know that for me, I've edited I had a lot of fun about a couple years ago, especially during like the height of the pandemic. I was editing trailer like videos where I would take a trailer and I would kind of re-edit it.
Yes.
And I had fun once with the Alita Battle Angel trailer, and what I did was I had two scene like, it's hard to explain, but it was the trailer, and then I actually had another version of the trailer behind it with like the dialogue. So one version of the trailer had no dialogue in it, and then I interlaced it with the other trailer with the dialogue. And when you're watching it, you wouldn't actually be able to tell that it's two different trailers interlaced together, which I personally had a lot of fun doing that. I think I did that on DaVinci Resolve, which is a very, very if I had any advice for anybody, I would say that is also a free option that many people can use.
Mm-hmm.
And like you mentioned, the iPhone is another at least free option. Well, the iPhone costs money, but if you have the iPhone,
if you have any kind of a video camera, just try it.
Anyone.
Again, the best stories are the medium it's told on don't necessarily matter. I've seen some of the most incredible films that were filmed on iPhones, and you go, "Oh my God!" It's really about
Steven Soderbergh's work is, I watched Kimmy. Kimmy was actually one of my favorite movies of 2022, and it's very underrated. But that was shot on, it's amazing.
Love that. I love it.
So
it's
good.
So perfectly signal-based editing and super smart, and that Marianne editor of his is pretty great.
Yeah.
Of course, you know who I speak of. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Tim, for joining me in this interview. It was an absolute blast, and I'm hoping that anyone that watches this is either inspired to either edit or film anything they like to. Also, it also gives a lot of people a lot more insight on how a show like The Last of Us was made. And I just like to thank you for joining, and thank everyone who watched this video. And hopefully in the next number of days, David will feel better enough and he will
Yeah,
come back and return, and we'll be doing more episodes of our Real Talks. And also, we will also be watching more of The Last of Us. This Friday is the
yes,
well, at least on HBO Max, it will be streaming, and that way, if you are planning on watching the Super Bowl, you don't have to worry about that.
exactly.
You can watch it early, and the plus side is we get 2 episodes of The Last of Us this week that were
Correct.
both edited by yours truly, Timothy Goode, right here, and I am really looking forward to next week. I've heard nothing but great things.
That's a big one.
So yeah, thank you everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Bye.